It was just another Tuesday in downtown Cincinnati, the kind of day where people rush past each other without making eye contact, where the sounds of traffic and hurried footsteps create the soundtrack of urban indifference. For Michael, it was day number 342 of living on the streets. Not that he was counting anymore. The days had begun to blur together in a haze of hunger, fatigue, and quiet desperation. Michael hadn't always been homeless. 3 years ago, he was working as a machinist at a factory that had been in operation since his grandfather's time. Then came the notice. The plant was closing, operations moving overseas. At 57, with no college degree and specialized skills that suddenly had no market, Michael found himself adrift. The severance package lasted 6 months. The unemployment check stretched another 4. His savings covered rent for almost a year. Then came the eviction notice, followed by nights in his car until it was repossessed, and finally, the streets. The morning had been particularly rough. The shelter had been full the night before, so Michael had slept under the highway overpass, his cardboard bed doing little to soften the concrete beneath or shield him from the late autumn chill. His back ached, and his stomach growled with a familiar emptiness. He had made exactly $4.35 so far today, enough maybe for a cup of coffee and a fast food hamburger if he was careful. That's when he noticed the small crowd gathering outside the local diner. There were a few news cameras, some people with phones raised, the buzz of anticipation in the air. Michael had learned to pay attention to crowds. Sometimes they meant trouble, but sometimes they meant opportunity. People caught up in excitement or distraction were more likely to spare some change. "Who's coming?" he asked a young woman standing at the edge of the group. "J.D. Vance," she said, not taking her eyes off the diner entrance. "He's doing some kind of local business tour thing." The name sounded vaguely familiar to Michael. Politics had once mattered to him, back when he had a TV and an address where he could receive a voter registration card. Now, the grand debates of national policy seemed distant, irrelevant to the immediate question of where his next meal would come from. "That's him," someone whispered nearby. J.D. Vance paused on the sidewalk, shaking hands with those who reached out, smiling for cell phone cameras. Michael watched from his spot against the wall, separate from the eager crowd, invisible as the homeless often are. The politician was working his way down the line of people. His path would take him right past where Michael stood. Michael's heart began to race. He had never directly approached someone important before. His routine was to sit quietly, cup extended, eyes down, letting people make their own decisions about whether to help. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the $4.35 in his pocket that wouldn't stretch far enough. Maybe it was the lingering pain in his back from the cold concrete. Or maybe it was simply that, after almost a year of being unseen, he desperately needed someone, anyone, to acknowledge his existence. As Vance passed within a few feet of him, Michael summoned his courage and took a step forward, his paper cup extended. "Excuse me, sir," Michael said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Could you spare $1?" The security men tensed immediately, one stepping between Michael and Vance with practiced efficiency. But Vance held up a hand, stopping his protector's intervention. The crowd around them quieted, many turning to stare at the unexpected interaction. Several phones were raised, recording the moment. Vance looked at Michael, really looked at him, in a way that few people had in a very long time. Not the quick, dismissive glance of someone uncomfortable with the sight of poverty, not the studiously averted eyes of those who feared being asked for money, but a direct, human gaze that seemed to take in Michael's weathered face, his worn clothes, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "What's your name?" Vance asked, his voice calm and steady. The question caught Michael off guard. He had expected either a dollar hastily thrust his way or a polite refusal. Maybe an awkward apology about not carrying cash. He had not expected to be asked for his name, to be addressed as a person rather than a problem. "Michael," he answered after a moment's hesitation. "Michael Donovan." "How long have you been on the streets, Michael?" Vance asked. The crowd around them had gone completely silent now, the only sounds the distant traffic and the click of cameras. Michael shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of so many eyes. "About a year," he said. "Lost my job at the Fairfield manufacturing plant when it closed. Couldn't find anything else at my age." Something flickered across Vance's face, Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He nodded slowly. Fairfield, he repeated. My grandfather worked in a place like that. Steel mill, though, not manufacturing. I know what those closures did to communities around here. Michael nodded, unsure what to say. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. The politician should have already moved on, the moment of awkwardness quickly forgotten in the flow of the campaign day. Instead, Vance glanced at his aide and said, "Cancel my next appointment." The aide started to protest, but Vance shook his head. "Just reschedule it. This is important." He turned back to Michael. "Are you hungry? Let's get some lunch." Michael stared at him in disbelief. "I don't need charity," he said, though his empty stomach loudly disagreed. "It's not charity," Vance replied. "It's a conversation. I'd like to hear your story if you're willing to share it. Stories like yours matter." Michael hesitated, looking around at the crowd, watching them with curious eyes. Some were still filming with their phones. Vance seemed to read his discomfort. "We can go somewhere quieter," he offered. "No cameras, just talk." Michael studied the politician's face, looking for the telltale signs of insincerity he had become adept at recognizing. The patronizing smile, the impatient shifting of weight, the eyes already moving on to the next person. He saw none of these. Instead, he saw something that looked remarkably like genuine interest. "Okay," Michael said finally, "but I'm not much for politics these days." Vance smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "That's all right. Today, I'm not asking for your vote. I'm just asking for your story." As they turned to walk back into the diner together, Michael noticed the expressions on the faces in the crowd. Some showed surprise, others skepticism. A few, particularly among the older onlookers, showed something else. The unmistakable sheen of tears, a recognition of something unexpectedly human in this political moment. And for the first time in 342 days, Michael felt something stir within him. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but perhaps the possibility that hope might still exist in the world after all. Inside the diner, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The lunch rush had ended, leaving behind the lingering scent of burgers and coffee. A few regular customers glanced up as they entered, their expressions changing from casual curiosity to stunned recognition when they saw who had walked in. The waitress nearly dropped her coffee pot. "Table for two, please," Vance said, his tone casual, as if dining with homeless strangers was something he did every day. "Somewhere quiet, if possible." The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and dyed red hair, recovered quickly and led them to a booth in the back corner. Michael slid awkwardly into the vinyl seat, acutely aware of his unwashed clothes, his unkempt beard, the lingering odor that came from too many nights without a proper shower. He could feel the stares from the other patrons, their whispers barely contained. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, setting down two menus. "Coffee's good," Michael mumbled, his eyes fixed on the laminated menu, though the words swam before him. When was the last time he'd sat in a restaurant? 8 months ago? 10? He couldn't remember. When the waitress returned with their coffee, Vance ordered a full breakfast for Michael and a turkey sandwich for himself. Michael started to protest. Breakfast at 2 in the afternoon seemed extravagant, but his rumbling stomach silenced his objections. "So," Vance said once they were alone, stirring a packet of sugar into his coffee. "Fairfield Manufacturing. They made auto parts, right?" Michael nodded, surprised that Vance knew this detail. 32 years I worked there. Started right after high school in '89. My father got me the job, same as his father did for him. 3 generations, Vance remarked. That used to be the backbone of America. Families building careers in one place, passing down not just jobs, but pride and craftsmanship. "Yeah, well," Michael shrugged. "Doesn't mean much now. Company said they could pay workers in Mexico a quarter of what they paid us. Can't blame them, I guess. It's business." "I can blame them," Vance said, his voice suddenly harder. "We've been sold this story that it's just the natural order of things, that globalization is inevitable, and communities like yours are just collateral damage." He shook his head. "It doesn't have to be that way." "What did you try after the plant closed?" Vance asked. Michael's expression darkened. "Everything. Applied for warehouse work, security jobs, even tried to get on with the city maintenance crew. Either I was overqualified, or they wanted computer skills I don't have, or they just took one look at my gray hair and decided I wouldn't fit in. He stared into his coffee. Unemployment ran out. Couldn't make rent. You know how the rest goes. The waitress arrived with their food, a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast for Michael, and a modest sandwich for Vance. Michael tried to maintain his dignity, to eat slowly despite the hunger gnawing at him, but the sight and smell of real food overcame his restraint. He ate with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned that meals were not guaranteed. Vance waited until Michael had taken the edge off his hunger, before speaking again. I grew up in Middletown, not far from here. My grandparents raised me after my mom got caught up in addiction. They were from the hills of Kentucky originally, came north for factory work, like thousands of others. Michael paused mid-bite, studying Vance with new interest. That right? My papa worked at Armco Steel for 30 years, lost his pension when they restructured in the 80s. Vance's eyes grew distant. I watched what that did to him, to his sense of who he was. A man who'd built his identity around providing for his family, around being part of something bigger than himself. When that was taken away, he trailed off. It breaks something in you, Michael finished quietly. Makes you question everything you thought was solid. That America's gone, Michael said flatly. Maybe, Vance acknowledged, or maybe it just got lost somewhere along the way. He leaned forward. Tell me what happened after Fairfield closed. The details matter. So, Michael told him, about the months of increasingly desperate job searching, about depleting his modest savings, about selling his car to cover 3 months of rent, banking on finding work in that time, about the eviction notice taped to his door when those 3 months yielded nothing but rejection letters and unanswered applications. About the night he slept in the park for the first time, too ashamed to call his daughter in Tennessee, who was struggling with her own young family. My ex-wife passed 5 years ago, cancer, Michael explained. My daughter's got 3 kids and a husband who works construction. They barely make ends meet themselves. I couldn't. His voice caught. I couldn't burden them. Have you told her, Vance asked gently, about your situation? Michael shook his head, shame coloring his weathered face. She thinks I'm staying with a buddy from the plant. I call her from the library sometimes, tell her everything's fine. She's got enough to worry about. Vance was quiet for a moment, considering. Pride is a powerful thing, he finally said. Sometimes it's all we have left when everything else has been taken. I respect that. He paused. But family is powerful too. You don't understand, Michael said, an edge creeping into his voice. I was supposed to be the one they could count on. I was the dad, the provider. Now what am I? A burden, a failure. You're a man who worked hard his whole life and got caught in forces bigger than yourself, Vance countered. That's not failure. That's being human in a system that's stopped valuing humanity. Michael looked up, surprised by the conviction in Vance's voice. For a brief moment, the politician facade seemed to slip, revealing something more personal underneath. Why are you doing this? Michael asked suddenly. There are cameras outside. Shouldn't you be shaking hands or giving speeches or whatever it is you people do? Vance smiled slightly at the blunt question. You mean, what's my angle? He considered this. Maybe I'm tired of talking about problems I've only read about. Maybe I want to hear directly from someone living them. He paused. Or maybe I just needed a reminder of why I got into this whole mess in the first place. Before Michael could respond, the waitress approached with the check. Vance took it automatically, but his focus remained on Michael. Michael stared at him, weighing whether this was just another political performance or something genuine. The question hung between them, unexpected and strangely intimate. And for the first time in a very long time, someone with power was actually waiting for his answer. The question lingered in the air between them. What would actually help? Michael had been asked many things during his time on the streets, where he slept, why he didn't just get a job, whether he'd tried this shelter or that program, but never this. Never what he thought would make a difference. Michael took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't used to being asked his opinion on anything that mattered anymore. "It's not just one thing," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "Everyone thinks there's some magic solution. Just get a job, just go to rehab, just move somewhere cheaper. But when you're down here, everything's connected. You need an address to get a job. You need a job to get an address. You need a phone for interviews. You need money for a phone." He shook his head. "It's a maze with no exit." Vance nodded, listening with an intensity that made Michael feel, for the first time in months, like his words carried weight. "The programs that exist," Michael continued, warming to the subject, "they're all separate pieces. This place helps with food but not shelter. That place offers a bed but kicks you out at 7 a.m. Another place can help with job training, but only if you already have stable housing." He spread his hands in frustration. "Nobody looks at the whole person. Nobody sees how it all fits together." "Or doesn't fit together," Vance observed. "Exactly." Michael paused, surprised at how much he had to say, now that someone was genuinely listening. "And dignity. That's what gets lost first. The way people look through you, not at you. The way they assume you're drunk or crazy or lazy. After a while, you start to believe it yourself." Vance was quiet for a moment, absorbing Michael's words. Then he pulled a small notebook from his pocket and jotted something down. "So, if you could design the ideal support system," Vance asked, "what would it look like?" Michael leaned back, the question catching him off guard. He'd spent so long just trying to survive day to day that thinking about systemic solutions felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. "I guess it would start with stability," he said slowly. "Not just a bed for tonight, but a place where you can stay long enough to catch your breath, to think beyond the next meal or the next night." He tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. Job opportunities that don't require a college degree but still pay enough to live on. Not just minimum wage burger flipping, real work with dignity, work that makes use of the skills people already have. "Like your manufacturing experience," Vance suggested. "Right. 32 years on an assembly line taught me plenty. Precision, attention to detail, problem solving. But those skills don't translate well on paper, and companies don't want to invest in older workers they see as outdated." "What else?" Vance prompted. "Healthcare," Michael said promptly. "Not just emergency care when things get bad, but preventative stuff. Regular checkups, dental work." He ran his tongue over a broken molar that had been causing him pain for months. "Mental health support too, being homeless. It does something to your mind, makes you forget who you were before." Vance nodded, continuing to take notes. Michael found himself wondering if this was all for show, but the genuine attention in Vance's eyes suggested otherwise. "And what about personal responsibility?" Vance asked. "That's a big theme in political conversations about poverty and homelessness." Michael's face hardened slightly. "I've taken responsibility every day of my life, worked hard, paid my taxes, raised my daughter right, did everything society told me to do." His voice took on an edge. "But responsibility has to go both ways. Companies that close plants after decades of community support should have responsibility too. Banks that foreclose on homes should have responsibility. Politicians who promise jobs that never materialize should have responsibility." He caught himself, suddenly aware that he was lecturing a politician, but Vance didn't seem offended. "You're right," Vance said simply. "The social contract is broken down, and it's usually the people at the bottom who get blamed for it." He closed his notebook and looked directly at Michael. "Thank you for your honesty. Most people I talk to are either trying to impress me or asking for something." "Well, I did ask you for $1, Michael reminded him with a hint of a smile. Vance chuckled. "So, you did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet again, but instead of $1, he withdrew a business card and wrote something on the back. "Michael, I came to Cincinnati to meet with a friend of mine who runs Midwest Manufacturing Solutions. They're a smaller operation than Fairfield, but they're expanding, not contracting. They're looking for experienced floor managers who understand both the technical and human sides of production." Michael stared at the card Vance slid across the table. "I don't understand." "Call this number tomorrow morning," Vance said, tapping the card. "Ask for David Myers. Tell him I sent you. He'll set up an interview. Michael shook his head in disbelief. I appreciate the thought, but look at me. I haven't had a proper shower in weeks. My clothes are... He gestured at his worn attire. And I don't have a phone, or an address, or dash. That's why I wrote this address on the back, Vance interrupted, turning the card over. It's a transitional housing program called New Start, not a shelter, an actual apartment where you can stay for up to 6 months while you get back on your feet. They provide professional clothes for interviews, a prepaid phone, an address for job applications, all the pieces that you said need to connect. Michael stared at the card, then at Vance, suspicion creeping into his expression. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. Because your story is my grandfather's story, Vance said quietly. It's the story of thousands of workers across Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana and Michigan. Hardworking people who did everything right and still ended up caught in forces beyond their control. He leaned forward. And because I believe in second chances, not just talking about them, but actually creating them. There's one catch, Vance added. Michael's face fell slightly. Of course there was a catch. There was always a catch. The New Start program requires participants to reconnect with family when possible, Vance explained. They believe, and I agree, that rebuilding those relationships is crucial to long-term stability. You mean my daughter? Michael said, his voice suddenly tight. Yes. Would you be willing to call her? Not to ask for anything, Vance clarified quickly. Just to tell her the truth, to let her know what's happened and that you're working to change things. Michael stared down at the table, emotions warring on his weathered face. Pride, shame, fear, and underneath it all, a desperate longing to hear his daughter's voice again. I don't want her to see me like this, he whispered. Michael was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing on him. Finally, he reached out and took the card, his hand trembling slightly. I'll call her, he said, his voice rough with emotion. And Mr. Myers, too. As they prepared to leave the diner, Michael paused, looking at Vance with newfound respect. You never did give me that $1 I asked for. Vance laughed. No, I didn't. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $1 bill, placing it on the table between them. But here it is. What are you going to do with it? Michael looked at the dollar, then out the window at the street where he had been standing just an hour ago. So much had changed in so little time. The possibility of work, of shelter, of reconnection with his daughter. These weren't just abstract hopes anymore, but tangible steps waiting to be taken. He picked up the dollar and carefully folded it, placing it in his pocket. I'm going to save it, he said, to remind me of today, of what can happen when someone really sees you. The waitress, no longer pretending not to listen, wiped quickly at her eyes with the corner of her apron. And outside the diner window, the small crowd that had gathered earlier watched as 2 men, one in pressed khakis, one in worn jeans, walked out together, not as politician and homeless man, but as 2 human beings who had found unexpected common ground. The New Start Center occupied a renovated apartment building in a quiet neighborhood just east of downtown. Its brick facade was clean but unassuming, with nothing but a small plaque beside the door indicating its purpose. Michael stood on the sidewalk outside, clutching the business card Vance had given him, uncertainty gripping him despite the politician's assurances. He had spent the night at a shelter, one last night among the familiar faces and routines that had become his reluctant community. Some had congratulated him when he shared his news, genuine happiness in their weathered faces. Others had been skeptical, warning him not to get his hopes up, that politicians made promises they never kept. A few had simply turned away, perhaps unable to bear the thought that escape was possible for some, but not for them. Now, in the clear light of morning, Michael hesitated at the threshold of change. What if this was all an elaborate setup? What if the people inside laughed at him, told him there was no place for someone like him? What if the job interview was a polite fiction, a way for Vance to feel good about himself without actually committing to anything? But the alternative, turning away, returning to the streets, was unthinkable now that hope had taken root. Drawing a deep breath, Michael pushed open the door and stepped inside. Can I help you? She asked. Michael cleared his throat nervously. I, J.D. Vance sent me, said to ask for the New Start program. He held out the card as if it were a ticket to some exclusive event. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Vance's name, but she recovered quickly, taking the card and examining it. "Of course," she said, her voice warming. "You must be Michael Donovan. We were told to expect you." She stood and extended her hand. "I'm Teresa Wilkins, the program coordinator here." Michael stared at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it, the simple courtesy of a handshake, of being treated as an equal, momentarily overwhelming him. "We have a studio apartment ready for you," Teresa continued, seemingly unaware of his emotional state. "It's small but private. You'll share common areas like the kitchen and laundry facilities with 3 other residents, but you'll have your own bathroom and sleeping space." "Let me show you around," Teresa said, grabbing a set of keys from a drawer, "and then we can sit down to discuss the program requirements and get your paperwork started." The tour was brief but comprehensive. The building housed 12 units, each occupied by program participants at various stages of their journey back to stability. The common areas were clean and functional, a shared kitchen with labeled cabinet space for each resident, a small laundry room with free-to-use machines, a community room with a television, and a bookshelf full of donated paperbacks. Michael's studio was on the 2nd floor, a modest space with a twin bed, a small desk, a dresser, and a bathroom with a shower that made his heart leap at the prospect of hot water whenever he wanted it. On the bed lay a welcome package, toiletries, towels, a prepaid phone, and a folder containing program information. "This is more than I expected," Michael said quietly, running his hand over the clean bedspread. Teresa smiled. "That's what we aim for, to exceed expectations, but in a sustainable way. This isn't charity, Michael. It's an investment in your future, and we expect you to invest too." Back in her office, Teresa outlined the program requirements: weekly meetings with a case manager, attendance at financial literacy workshops, participation in the community dinner once a week, and active job searching or employment. Michael nodded along, the structure both intimidating and reassuring after months of chaotic survival. "Now," Teresa said, her tone becoming more serious, "I understand you have a daughter." Michael's expression tightened. "Yes, in Tennessee. One of our core beliefs at New Start is that rebuilding family connections is essential to long-term stability," Teresa explained gently. "We don't force contact if there's a history of abuse or danger, but in most cases, we strongly encourage participants to reconnect with family members who can provide emotional support." "She doesn't know," Michael said, his voice barely audible, "about any of this. Being homeless, I mean." Teresa nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's common. Pride is a powerful force, but secrets create distance, and distance can become permanent if we're not careful." The echo of Vance's words from the previous day wasn't lost on Michael. He wondered how many other desperate souls the politician had guided to this place, or if he was somehow special, a particularly photogenic example of compassionate conservatism in action. Michael nodded, his throat tight. "And the job?" Vance mentioned something about an interview. "Yes," Teresa checked her notes. "David Myers at Midwest Manufacturing Solutions is expecting your call this morning. The number is programmed into your phone as contact number 1. The reality of these concrete steps, a place to stay, a possible job, reconnection with his daughter, was beginning to sink in. For the first time in a year, Michael could see beyond the next meal, the next night's shelter. He could see a path, however uncertain, back to the person he used to be. After completing the necessary paperwork, Michael returned to his studio. He sat on the edge of the bed, his bed, and took out the prepaid phone. The plastic was cool in his hand, the weight of it surprisingly heavy with possibility. He dialed contact number 1 with trembling fingers. "Midwest Manufacturing Solutions, this is David," a brisk voice answered after 2 rings. "Hello," Michael said, his voice catching slightly. "My name is Michael Donovan. J.D. Vance suggested I call about a possible position." There was a brief pause, then genuine warmth entered David's tone. "Michael, yes, I've been expecting your call. J.D. spoke very highly of your experience at Fairfield." The conversation that followed was both professional and remarkably easy. David asked about Michael's specific role at Fairfield, his experience with various manufacturing processes, his management style when overseeing line workers. It was as if the past year had momentarily vanished, and Michael was simply a professional discussing his qualifications with a potential employer. "I'd like you to come in for a formal interview tomorrow morning," David said finally. "Nothing too intimidating, just a chance to meet in person and show you around our facility. Does 10 a.m. work for you?" "Yes," Michael said, a smile spreading across his face despite himself. "That works perfectly." After hanging up, Michael sat in the quiet of his new room, the magnitude of the day's changes washing over him. He had shelter, he had a job interview, he had the beginnings of a future again, but he still hadn't made the hardest call of all. Michael stared at the phone in his hand, his daughter's number memorized but undialed. What would he say? How could he explain a year of lies and evasions? How could he tell his little girl, a woman now with children of her own, that her father had been sleeping under bridges while pretending everything was fine? Outside his window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor of his new room. In less than 24 hours, his life had changed direction completely, from invisible to seen, from hopeless to hopeful. All because he had asked a stranger for $1. Michael stood before the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man who stared back at him. Teresa had arranged for a volunteer barber to come by that evening, transforming his wild beard and unkempt hair into something presentable. The New Start program's clothing bank had provided him with a decent outfit for his interview: dark slacks, a blue button-down shirt, and a navy blazer that fit surprisingly well. Clean shoes completed the transformation. "You can do this," he told his reflection, straightening his collar one last time before heading out. The receptionist greeted him warmly, offering coffee while he waited. Michael accepted gratefully, cupping the warm mug between his hands, a simple pleasure he had missed during his time on the streets. 10 minutes later, a man in his early 40s approached with an extended hand. "Michael, I'm David Myers. Thank you for coming in." David's handshake was firm, his manner direct but friendly as he led Michael through the facility. Unlike many executives who rarely ventured onto the factory floor, David seemed completely at home among the machinery and workers, greeting several by name as they passed. "We specialize in precision components for medical devices," David explained as they walked. "Smaller scale than auto parts, but growing rapidly as the population ages and healthcare technology advances." He gestured to a line where workers were operating complex machinery. "These machines require experienced oversight, someone who understands both the technical aspects and the human elements of keeping a production line running smoothly." Michael nodded, watching the operation with trained eyes. "I see you're using the Takano system for quality control," he observed. "We implemented a similar approach at Fairfield in my last few years there, reduced defects by nearly 30%. David's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "You know your stuff." They continued the tour, Michael asking informed questions, occasionally offering observations about potential efficiency improvements almost instinctively. In the conference room afterwards, the formal interview felt more like a professional conversation between colleagues. Michael explained his experience, his management philosophy, his approach to problem-solving on the line. For those brief hours, his homelessness fell away. He was simply a manufacturing professional discussing his craft. "I'll be straight with you, Michael," David said as the interview concluded. "JD told me about your situation. Not everything, just that you've fallen on hard times after Fairfield closed." Michael tensed, waiting for the inevitable shift in tone, the subtle withdrawal that usually followed such revelations. Instead, David leaned forward. "I respect a man who can weather that kind of storm and still present himself as professionally as you have today. It shows character." He tapped his pen against his notepad thoughtfully. "I'm prepared to offer you a 3-month probationary position as a line supervisor on our medical components division. Standard benefits package, competitive salary." He named a figure that made Michael's breath catch. It was slightly less than he'd made at Fairfield after 3 decades, but far more than he'd dared hope for after a year of unemployment. "If the first 3 months go well," David continued, "we'll convert it to a permanent position with a performance review and potential raise at the 6-month mark. He held out his hand. What do you say? Michael stared at the outstretched hand, momentarily overwhelmed. Yes, thank you. I won't let you down. I know you won't, David smiled. JD's a good judge of character, and so am I. You start Monday at 7 a.m. HR will email the paperwork to get you set up. As Michael left the building, paperwork clutched in his hand, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had a job, a real job with benefits and a future. The path back to stability, to identity beyond survival, was suddenly clear before him. But one crucial step remained. Back in his room at New Start, Michael sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He had rehearsed what to say a dozen times, but the words still felt inadequate, the fear of disappointment and judgment still acute. Finally, taking a deep breath, he dialed his daughter's number. Dad? Sarah's voice came through after the third ring, surprised but pleased. I was just thinking about you. How are you? I'm better, Michael said carefully. I actually have some news to share. Good news. Michael closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Before I tell you, I need to be honest about something. Something I've been keeping from you. There was a brief silence. Dad, what's wrong? He told her everything then. The unsuccessful job search, the depletion of his savings, the eviction, the nights in his car, and finally, the streets. With each revelation, he expected her voice to fill with disappointment or anger at his deception. Instead, he heard only quiet tears. Why didn't you tell me? She asked finally, her voice thick with emotion. We would have helped. You could have come to stay with us. Your family is already struggling, Michael explained. And I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see me like that, to know that your father couldn't even keep a roof over his head. Oh, Dad, Sarah's voice broke. Your worth isn't measured by your job or your house. You taught me that, remember? When I was 15 and so worried about having the right clothes, the right friends. You told me what matters is who we are inside, how we treat others, that we try our best. Michael's eyes burned with unshed tears as his own lessons returned to him through his daughter's voice. I have a new job, he said after a moment, steering toward the good news. And a temporary place to stay while I get back on my feet. Things are turning around. How did this happen? Sarah asked. Michael smiled slightly. You won't believe it. I asked a politician for $1, and he ended up changing my life instead. He told her about Vance, about their conversation in the diner, about the New Start program and Midwest manufacturing. So, when can I see you? Sarah asked when he had finished. The kids miss their grandpa, and clearly, I need to check on you more often. For the first time in their conversation, Michael felt a lightness in his chest, the heavy burden of secrecy finally lifted. Maybe in a few weeks? Once I get my first paycheck and find my footing at the new job. Promise? Sarah pressed. I promise, Michael said, meaning it. No more secrets. After they hung up, Michael sat in the quiet of his room, tears flowing freely down his face. They weren't tears of shame or sorrow, but of relief, of reconnection. The call hadn't gone as he feared. There had been no judgment, no disappointment, only love and the unbreakable bond of family that had been there all along, waiting for him to reach out and grasp it. Outside his window, the evening sky had turned a deep purple, streaked with orange. A new day was ending, but for Michael, it felt like the beginning of something that had been lost for far too long. Hope, purpose, belonging. Michael's first day at Midwest Manufacturing began early. He was awake before his alarm, a mixture of nervousness and excitement keeping sleep at bay. The routine of preparing for work, showering, shaving, dressing in the company polo and khakis provided by HR, felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like rediscovering the lyrics to a song long forgotten. He arrived 30 minutes early, thermos of coffee in hand, and was greeted warmly by the security guard at the entrance. You must be Donovan, the guard said, checking his ID against the list. David mentioned you'd be starting today. Good to have you aboard. The morning unfolded in a blur of introductions, paperwork, and orientation. Michael met the team he would be supervising, 8 line workers with varying levels of experience, all regarding their new boss with the cautious neutrality of employees who had seen supervisors come and go. "I'm not here to reinvent the wheel," Michael told them during their first team meeting. "I'm here to listen and learn first, then work with you to make things run as smoothly as possible. My door is always open." He saw a few skeptical glances exchanged, but also some tentative nods of approval. It would take time to earn their trust, but Michael was no stranger to the process. At Fairfield, he had started on the line himself, working his way up over decades. He understood the wariness of floor workers toward management. By lunchtime, Michael had begun to find his rhythm. The machinery was more advanced than what he'd worked with at Fairfield, but the principles remained the same. His trained eye caught small inefficiencies in the production flow, but he kept his observations to himself for now. First, he needed to understand the people, not just the process. In the cafeteria, David waved him over to join a table of supervisors and managers. The conversation was casual but probing. They were sizing him up, determining where he fit in the company hierarchy. Michael answered their questions honestly but carefully, aware that first impressions among colleagues could shape his entire experience. "So," one manager finally asked, "is it true J.D. Vance personally recommended you?" Michael paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He had wondered when this would come up. "Heard there was quite a story behind it," another supervisor pressed. "Something about you asking him for spare change?" The table grew quiet, all eyes on Michael. This was the moment that would define him here. Would he be seen as the homeless charity case, or as a qualified professional who had weathered a difficult chapter? "The economy has been tough since Fairfield Manufacturing closed," Michael said evenly. "I hit a rough patch, like thousands of others when these plants shut down. Mr. Vance and I had a conversation about the impact of those closures on workers like me. He saw value in my experience and made a connection. I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I'm here because I have 32 years of manufacturing expertise to offer." David nodded approvingly from across the table. A few of the others murmured in agreement, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. The upcoming production targets, a recent quality control issue, plans for the company picnic next month. Crisis averted, at least for now. But as Michael returned to his work that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story, his story, was circulating beyond his control. He was right. That evening, as Michael returned to New Start, Teresa met him at the entrance, her expression a mixture of concern and excitement. "Have you seen the news?" she asked without preamble. Michael shook his head, confused. "I've been at work all day. Why?" Teresa led him to the community room, where several residents were gathered around the television. On screen, a news anchor was speaking over footage that made Michael's heart skip a beat. It was him and Vance, walking out of the diner together 5 days ago. What started as a simple request for spare change has evolved into an unexpected story of compassion and second chances, the anchor was saying. Sources close to J.D. Vance confirmed that the politician not only spent over an hour in conversation with the homeless veteran, but personally arranged housing and employment opportunities for him. "Veteran?" Michael muttered. "I never served. I never claimed to." The scene cut to a political analyst in a studio. This kind of personal intervention is rare in modern politics. While critics might call it a publicity stunt, supporters point to Vance's long-standing advocacy for working-class communities devastated by deindustrialization. This incident puts a human face on the policies he's been promoting. Michael sank into a chair, a sick feeling spreading through his stomach. He had been naive to think this would remain a private interaction, a simple act of kindness between two people. Of course it was political. Of course it would be weaponized by supporters and critics alike. "They're calling me a veteran," he said quietly to Teresa. "I never said that. My sign did, but I told Vance the truth." Teresa squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "Media gets details wrong all the time. Don't let it bother you." But it did bother him. Not just the inaccuracy, but the reduction of his complex life story to a convenient political narrative, either a heartwarming tale of compassion or a cynical exploitation of suffering, depending on one's political alignment. The news segment ended with a statement from Vance's office. Mr. Vance believes in the dignity of work and the importance of creating pathways back to employment for those who have been left behind by economic shifts. His conversation with Mr. Donovan reinforced his commitment to policies that support American workers and strengthen communities. No mention of Michael's actual story, no nuance about the complex web of factors that had led to his homelessness. Just a tidy narrative that fit neatly into campaign messaging. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Sarah. "Dad, are you on the news? People are sharing a story about you and JD Vance all over Facebook." Before he could respond, the phone buzzed again with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize, then another, and another. "You might want to turn that off for a while," Teresa advised, watching his growing distress. "Journalists can be persistent when they smell a story." "But I'm not a story," Michael protested. "I'm just a guy trying to rebuild his life." Teresa's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Right now, you're both, and you'll need to figure out how to navigate that." He thought about Vance, wondering if this had been the plan all along. Had their conversation in the diner been genuine, or had Michael simply been a convenient prop in a politician's narrative? He wanted to believe the former, but the cynicism that had settled in during his year on the streets made doubt creep in around the edges of his hope. Yet regardless of Vance's motives, the facts remained. Michael had shelter. He had a job. He had reconnected with his daughter. His life was transforming rapidly, moving from survival back toward thriving. The question now was, at what cost? And how would he maintain control of his own story as it became fodder for the insatiable machine of political theater? Michael had asked for $1. Instead, he'd unwittingly stepped into the spotlight of America's divided political stage. The next morning, Michael found 3 journalists waiting outside the New Start Center. They called out questions as he tried to make his way to the bus stop, cameras pointed at his face, microphones thrust toward him. He kept his head down, mumbling no comment, as Teresa had advised him to do, but their persistence rattled him. "Mr. Donovan, how does it feel to have your life changed by JD Vance? Can you tell us about your military service? Which war did you serve in? Do you think politicians should do more direct intervention like this?" By the time he reached work, Michael was shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. The receptionist greeted him with wide eyes. "There's been several calls for you already," she said. "Mr. Myers said to send you directly to his office when you arrived." David was waiting, his expression concerned but not accusatory. "Quite a situation you found yourself in," he said as Michael took a seat. "Want to tell me about it?" Michael sighed heavily. "I didn't ask for any of this attention. I just asked for $1, had a conversation, and accepted help that was offered. I had no idea it would turn into whatever this is." David nodded thoughtfully. The media loves these stories. They're simple, emotional, and fit neatly into existing narratives. But they're creating some complications we need to address. Michael's heart sank. Was he about to lose his job before he'd barely started? "First," David continued, "they're calling you a veteran. Are you?" "No," Michael said firmly. "I had a sign that claimed that because it seemed to help with donations. I'm not proud of the lie, but when you're desperate..." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "But I told Vance the truth during our conversation. I never claimed military service to him or to you." "I believe you," David said. "But we need to correct that narrative before it goes any further. Falsely claiming veteran status, even through a misunderstanding, could damage both your reputation and the company's." "I'll make a statement," Michael agreed readily. "The last thing I want is to disrespect actual veterans." "Second issue," David continued, "is the disruption to our workplace. We can't have reporters harassing you here or calling constantly. It interferes with operations and puts you in an impossible position." Michael nodded grimly, waiting for the axe to fall. "So," David said, "here's what I propose. We issue a joint statement, you and the company, clarifying your background, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to return to work, and requesting privacy during this transition period. After that, no interviews, no comments. Just focus on your job." Michael blinked in surprise. "You're not firing me?" David looked genuinely startled by the question. Fire one of the most experienced line supervisors I've found in years? Over a media circus you didn't create? Not a chance. He leaned forward. Michael, your worth to this company is in your skills and experience, not your personal story. Though I admit, your resilience through hardship only increases my respect for you. Relief washed over Michael. Thank you, he said simply. Don't thank me yet, David warned. Issuing a statement means acknowledging the story, which might increase attention temporarily. And there's the veteran issue to correct, which some might see as controversial. Are you prepared for that? Michael thought about it, then nodded firmly. I'd rather face a difficult truth than live with a comfortable lie. I've had enough of hiding. An hour later, with the help of the company's PR person, they crafted a statement. It was straightforward and dignified, acknowledging Michael's recent homelessness while correcting the veteran misunderstanding and emphasizing his decades of manufacturing experience as the reason for his hiring. It requested privacy and expressed gratitude to both Vance and Midwest Manufacturing for the opportunity to rebuild. As predicted, the statement created another small flurry of media interest. Some outlets focused on the veteran correction, implying dishonesty. Others praised Michael's forthrightness. Most simply incorporated the new details into the existing narrative of redemption and second chances. Through it all, Michael kept his head down and focused on his work, drawing comfort from the predictable rhythms of the production line. His team, having read the news stories, regarded him with a new mixture of curiosity and respect, not for his brush with a politician or his time on the streets, but for his determination to move forward with honesty and dignity. That evening, Michael received a text from an unknown number. Mr. Donovan, this is J.D. Vance. Apologies for the media circus. Would appreciate a chance to speak with you. Can I call tomorrow? Michael stared at the message for a long time, emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with politics or publicity, but another part felt unfinished business remained between them. Yes, he texted back simply. The call came during Michael's lunch break the next day. He took it in the empty break room, his sandwich forgotten beside him. Michael, Vance's voice came through. How are you holding up? Managing, Michael replied cautiously. It's been intense. I owe you an apology, Vance said, surprising him. I never intended for your personal situation to become a public spectacle. Someone from my staff leaked the story to the press without my knowledge or approval. And the veteran thing? Michael asked, unable to keep a slight edge from his voice. A misunderstanding I've personally corrected in every interview, Vance assured him. Though I understand why you had that on your sign. Desperation forces difficult choices. Michael was silent, processing this. Vance continued, his voice more hesitant than it had been during their diner conversation. I want you to know something. What happened between us, that conversation, the connection to New Start and David, that wasn't political strategy. It was human to human. He paused. My grandfather really did work in that steel mill. Your story really did remind me of his. That wasn't manufactured for the cameras. Then why did your staff leak it? Michael challenged. Because politics is a machine that consumes authentic moments and turns them into talking points, Vance admitted. I can't pretend I'm not part of that machine, but I can try to preserve the humanity within it where possible. Michael considered this. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I do know that regardless of intentions, my life has improved significantly. I have shelter, work, reconnection with my daughter. For that, I'm grateful. Your statement was dignified, Vance said. Honest about the veteran misunderstanding, gracious about the opportunities. It showed character. It showed who I've always been, Michael corrected gently. Before homelessness, during, and after. That's what people miss about those on the streets. We're still ourselves underneath the circumstances. There was a thoughtful silence before Vance responded. That's profound, Michael, and true. Another pause. I have a proposition for you, but feel free to decline. Would you consider speaking at a small community forum I'm organizing? Not about me or politics, but about your experiences and what systems actually helped versus what didn't. Your perspective could inform better approaches. Michael hesitated. I'm not interested in becoming a poster child for any political movement. Understood completely, Vance assured him. This would be about policy substance, not political theater. No cameras, no press, just community leaders and service providers trying to improve systems. Michael thought about his conversation with Teresa, about the disconnected services and fragmented approach to homelessness he had experienced firsthand. Perhaps there was value in sharing those insights, in helping shape more effective approaches for others still struggling. I'll consider it, he said finally, but my priority right now is stabilizing my own life, building consistency at work, saving for my own place eventually, planning that visit to see my daughter and grandkids. Of course, Vance agreed readily. The invitation remains open when and if you're ready. After hanging up, Michael sat quietly, turning the conversation over in his mind. The cynical part of him still questioned Vance's motives, still wondered if he was being used as a convenient symbol in someone else's narrative. But the part of him that had begun to heal, the part that had reconnected with his daughter, that had found dignity in work again, that had started to trust in possibility, that part whispered that perhaps humanity could exist even within political frameworks, that perhaps stories like his could help bridge understanding across divided perspectives. He picked up his half-eaten sandwich and returned to work, still unsure of his place in the larger narrative unfolding around him, but increasingly certain of his place in his own story. And for now, that was enough. 3 weeks passed, and the media storm gradually subsided. Michael's story drifted from headline news to human interest sidebars, and finally into the background noise of the never-ending news cycle. Newer controversies emerged, fresher stories captured public attention, and Michael was granted the anonymity he craved. At Midwest Manufacturing, he had settled into a comfortable routine. The production line under his supervision had already shown a 12% increase in efficiency, with a corresponding decrease in defect rates. His approach, firm but fair, demanding quality while respecting the expertise of his team, had earned him the respect of his workers and the notice of upper management. The quarterly numbers for your section are impressive, David told him during their first performance review. This is exactly why I hired you. Experience can't be taught. Michael accepted the praise with quiet pride. This was familiar territory, a world where his value could be measured in tangible outcomes rather than sympathetic glances or political usefulness. Here, he wasn't the homeless man from the news, but Donovan from Line B, who knew exactly how to calibrate the finicky precision tools when they drifted out of alignment. At New Start, Michael had become something of a reluctant mentor to newer residents. He hadn't sought the role, but his steady progress and calm demeanor naturally drew others to him with questions about job applications, workplace dynamics, and the emotional challenges of rebuilding. How do you handle the shame? A newer resident named James had asked him one evening in the common area. James was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the haunted look of someone recently descended into homelessness. When people find out where you've been, what you've been through, how do you face them? Michael considered the question carefully. I realized shame was a luxury I couldn't afford, he finally said. It takes too much energy, and I needed all my energy to move forward. Besides, he added, what happened to me, to us, isn't just about personal failure. It's about systems failing, safety nets with holes too big to catch us. There's no shame in being caught in forces larger than yourself. James had nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but perhaps seeing a path forward he hadn't before. The moment that had most solidified Michael's sense of progress came when he received his second paycheck. After cashing it, he'd made his way to a small jewelry shop downtown and purchased a locket for his daughter and small toy trucks for his grandsons. Nothing extravagant, he was saving most of his earnings, but tangible expressions of connection, of his gradual return to the role of father and grandfather. Now, as he packed a small duffel bag for his weekend trip to Tennessee, Michael felt a nervous anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. Teresa had helped him arrange bus tickets, a 6-hour journey that would deliver him to his daughter's town by Friday evening. Sarah would meet him at the station, bring him to stay in their guest room for 2 nights, and return him to the bus on Sunday afternoon. 48 hours to begin rebuilding a relationship strained by secrets and absence. 48 hours to meet his youngest grandson, born during the months when Michael had been unreachable. 48 hours to start becoming family again, not just in name, but in presence. Got everything you need? Teresa asked, stopping by his room as he zipped the duffel bag closed. I think so, Michael nodded, doing a mental inventory. Clothes, toiletries, gifts for the kids. Teresa smiled. This is a big step. How are you feeling about it? Michael sat on the edge of his bed, considering. Nervous, he admitted. Excited, grateful. He looked up at her. A month ago, this wasn't even possible. Now here I am, employed, stable enough to travel, bringing gifts instead of burdens. You were never a burden, Michael, Teresa said gently. Even at your lowest point. That's what family means. Maybe, Michael acknowledged, but it feels better to approach them from a position of strength, not desperation. Later that evening, as Michael finished his final preparations, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David Myers. Good luck with the family visit. Take pictures of those grandkids to show us when you get back. Another buzz followed, a message from his line worker Miguel. Boss, don't worry about line B while you're gone. We got this covered. Enjoy your family. The messages continued. Simple, supportive notes from people who had been strangers just weeks ago, but were now becoming something like community. Each text, each expression of encouragement, felt like another brick in the foundation he was rebuilding beneath his feet. The final message came as Michael was setting his alarm for the early bus departure. It was from J.D. Vance. Heard from David that you're visiting family this weekend. Safe travels. Your story continues to inspire many, including me. Michael stared at this last message the longest, his feelings about Vance still complicated. Was this the message of a politician maintaining a useful connection, or the genuine well wishes of someone who cared about his progress? Perhaps it was both, the complexity of human interaction rarely reduced to simple either-or equations. He decided not to respond immediately. This weekend wasn't about politics or public narratives, it was about the private reconstruction of bonds that time and circumstances had strained but not broken. As he lay in bed that night, Michael reflected on the swift transformation of his circumstances. 6 weeks ago, he had been sleeping under an overpass, invisible to the hurried masses passing by. His existence narrowed to the primal concerns of food and shelter. Now he was employed, housed, connected, on the path back to full participation in the world he had fallen from. Had it really been as simple as asking the right stranger for $1? No, the path had never been that straightforward. His current situation was the result of multiple factors. Vance's intervention certainly, but also the existence of programs like New Start, employers like David willing to look beyond circumstances to capability, his own willingness to swallow pride and accept help, and the enduring love of a daughter who welcomed truth more than comfortable fiction. It was a tapestry of opportunity, timing, support, and personal effort, elements that had aligned in his favor but remained unavailable to thousands of others, still sleeping on streets, still invisible, still waiting for their own lives to change. Tomorrow he would board a bus to Tennessee, a journey that represented not just physical distance traversed, but the psychological territory between isolation and belonging, between survival and living. He would hug his daughter for the first time in years. He would meet his youngest grandson. He would sit at a family dinner table and belong there. And regardless of how his story was framed in political narratives or media reports, regardless of whether he was seen as a success story or a symbol or a statistic, Michael Donovan was reclaiming the most important story of all, his own. The bus rolled into the small Tennessee station as evening shadows lengthened across the parking lot. Michael sat up straighter, wiping his palms nervously on his jeans as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. Through the window, he scanned the small cluster of people waiting, and then he saw her. Sarah, his daughter, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, bouncing slightly on her toes as she searched the bus windows for his face. Their eyes met, and her expression bloomed into a smile so reminiscent of her mother's that Michael felt his chest tighten. He gathered his duffel bag and made his way down the narrow aisle, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd last seen her in person. 3 years? 4? Too long by any measure. As he stepped off the bus, Sarah rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him with surprising strength. "Dad," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice catching. "You're really here." Michael held her tightly, closing his eyes against the rush of emotion. How many nights on the streets had he dreamed of this moment? How many cold mornings had he woken up alone, aching for the simple comfort of family? "I'm here," he confirmed, his voice rough with feeling. "I'm here now." When they finally separated, Sarah held him at arm's length, studying his face. "You look good," she said. "Healthier than I expected." Michael smiled. 3 square meals a day and a regular shower will do that for a person. He kept his tone light, not wanting to dwell on the darker months. This weekend wasn't about what had been lost, but what was being reclaimed. "The boys are so excited," Sarah said as they walked to her car, a modest sedan with Cheerios scattered across the back seat and a collection of toy dinosaurs crowding the dashboard. Especially Max. He's been telling everyone at kindergarten that his grandpa is coming to visit. "And the baby?" Michael asked, settling into the passenger seat. "Liam just started walking last week." Sarah beamed with motherly pride. "He's into everything. Todd had to install baby gates on every doorway in the house." As they drove through the small town towards Sarah's home, Michael felt a curious doubling of time. It had been years since he'd been here, yet everything looked exactly as he remembered. The same Waffle House on the corner, the same Baptist church with its white steeple, the same elementary school where Sarah herself had once been a student. "How much did you tell them?" he asked quietly. "About my situation?" Sarah glanced at him, then back at the road. "Max knows you've been having a tough time and didn't have a home for a while. He's 7. He understands more than we sometimes give kids credit for. Tyler is 5, so he just knows Grandpa is coming to visit, and Liam is too young to understand anything, except that you're someone who belongs to our family." Michael nodded, grateful for her thoughtful handling of the difficult truth. "And Todd?" "Todd knows everything," Sarah said simply. "He's been worried about you too, Dad. We all have been." They turned onto a residential street lined with modest homes, finally pulling into the driveway of a small ranch-style house with a well-worn swing set in the yard and a basketball hoop above the garage. Before Sarah could even turn off the engine, the front door burst open and 2 small boys tumbled out, followed by a tall man carrying a toddler. "Grandpa!" the older boy shouted, running to the car. "Mom said you were coming, but I didn't know if it was today or tomorrow or next week." Michael stepped out of the car, instantly engulfed by small arms wrapped around his waist. He knelt down to proper hugging height, embracing both boys at once. "Max, you've grown a foot since I last saw you," he marveled, ruffling the older boy's hair. "And Tyler, I bet you're faster than your brother now, aren't you?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "I can run to the mailbox and back in 10 seconds. 9 seconds, Max corrected with brotherly precision. "I counted." Todd approached with the toddler, his free hand extended in a warm handshake. "Good to see you, Michael. Really good." There was no judgment in his son-in-law's eyes, only genuine welcome. Michael had always liked Todd, a construction foreman who worked hard, loved Sarah deeply, and treated her with the respect Michael had always hoped his daughter would find in a partner. "And this must be Liam," Michael said, gazing at the round-faced toddler, who regarded him with solemn curiosity. "Hello there, young man." Liam buried his face in his father's neck, suddenly shy, but peeked out with one eye to continue his assessment of this new person. "He'll warm up," Todd assured him. "Just needs a little time. Come on inside. Sarah made your favorite pot roast." The house was exactly what Michael had expected. Modestly furnished, slightly chaotic with the evidence of 3 active boys, but immaculately clean in the way Sarah had always kept her spaces. Family photos lined the walls, and Michael paused at several, noting the gaps in the timeline, the years of his absence. Dinner was a boisterous affair. Max and Tyler competed for their grandfather's attention, sharing school achievements, sports victories, and detailed explanations of their favorite video games. Liam, seated in a high chair, methodically smashed peas, while occasionally offering a toy to Michael, as if testing whether this new person knew the proper protocol for such gifts. Sarah and Todd shared glances across the table, relief, happiness, and something like vindication in their expressions. "We saved all your cards, Grandpa," Max announced as they cleared the dinner plates. "Mom put them in a special box, even though they were short." Michael winced slightly at the reminder of those brief, infrequent communications, postcards and short notes sent from library computers, deliberately vague about his circumstances. "I have better stories to tell you now," he promised, "and I'll write longer letters from now on." After dinner, the family gathered in the living room. Todd built a small fire in the fireplace, despite the mild evening, creating a circle of warmth and light that seemed to hold them all in its glow. The boys showed Michael their favorite toys, their art projects from school, the medal Max had won in a swimming competition. Michael presented his gifts, the toy trucks for the boys and the locket for Sarah, a simple silver oval containing a decades-old photo of Sarah as a baby with Michael and her mother on either side. "Oh, Dad," Sarah whispered, tracing the image with her fingertip. "I haven't seen this picture in years." "I've carried it in my wallet the whole time," Michael said quietly, "even during everything. Some things you don't let go of, no matter what." Later, after the younger boys were in bed and Max had reluctantly followed, the adults sat around the dying fire with cups of coffee. The conversation flowed easily among them, careful at first, then increasingly comfortable as the evening deepened. "We wanted to help," Sarah said finally, addressing the elephant in the room. "If we had known." "I know," Michael acknowledged, "but sometimes pride is all you have left. I couldn't bear for you to see me at my lowest." "Family isn't about seeing each other at our best," Todd observed quietly. "It's about seeing each other through our worst." Michael considered this, the simple wisdom of it settling in his chest like the warmth from the fire. "I'm learning that," he admitted. "Late, but I'm learning." As Michael settled into the small guest room that night, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a household at rest, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time, the sensation of being exactly where he belonged, of being part of something larger than his individual struggle. Tomorrow there would be pancakes with the boys, a trip to the local park, more stories and reconnections. The day after, he would return to Cincinnati, to his job and his room at New Start, to the life he was rebuilding piece by careful piece. But something fundamental had shifted during this visit. The family he had tried to protect through distance and deception was now part of his recovery, not separate from it. The circle had widened to include both his struggles and his triumphs. Michael drifted to sleep in a bed made up with fresh sheets that smelled of fabric softener, in a home where his name was spoken with love, in a family that had kept a place for him even when he couldn't claim it. And in that simple belonging, he found a healing deeper than any policy or program could provide. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Michael had asked a stranger for $1. 6 months of steady work, of rebuilding, of gradual healing. His 3-month probation at Midwest Manufacturing had concluded with a permanent job offer and a small raise. He had moved out of New Start into a modest 1-bedroom apartment of his own, nothing fancy, but clean and private, with a small balcony where he grew tomatoes in plastic buckets. Sarah and the boys had visited twice, filling his new space with laughter and noise before returning to Tennessee. Michael had a calendar on his refrigerator marked with dates for his next visit to them, this time for Christmas, his first holiday with family in years. The media interest had long since faded. Occasionally, someone would recognize him from the news stories, but these moments grew increasingly rare. Michael preferred it that way. He had never sought the spotlight. He had only sought $1, a moment of human acknowledgement in a world that had rendered him invisible. The community forum that Vance had invited him to speak at had been postponed twice due to scheduling conflicts, and then seemingly forgotten. Michael hadn't pressed the issue, while part of him believed his experiences might help inform better approaches to homelessness. Another part was content to focus on his own rebuilding without the complications of public attention. But on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months after their first encounter, Michael received a text message from Vance, "In Cincinnati today. Would you consider meeting for coffee? The same diner as before." Michael stared at the message, turning it over in his mind. His life had assumed a comfortable rhythm now: work, home, regular calls with Sarah, occasional social events with co-workers. Did he want to revisit the complicated beginning of his journey back to stability? After careful consideration, he texted back, "12:30 works for me." The diner looked exactly as he remembered it. The same worn booths, the same smell of coffee and grilled sandwiches, the same waitress with dyed red hair who did a double take when she saw him. "You look different," she said, pouring his coffee without being asked. "Healthier." "Feel different too," Michael acknowledged with a small smile. Vance arrived 5 minutes later, alone this time. No security, no aides, no campaign entourage. He looked more tired than Michael remembered, the weight of public office visible in the new lines around his eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," Vance said as he slid into the booth across from Michael. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Michael admitted. He studied the politician across from him, trying to reconcile the public figure with the man who had sat in this same booth 6 months ago and listened, really listened, to his story. "How are you?" Vance asked, genuine interest in his voice. "David Myers speaks highly of your work." "I'm doing well," Michael said. "Working, housed, reconnected with family, building something sustainable." Vance nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "I'm glad to hear it. Your journey has stayed with me, you know, in more ways than I expected." The waitress returned to take their orders, a turkey sandwich for Vance just as before, and a BLT for Michael. When she left, a comfortable silence settled between them. "Why did you want to meet?" Michael finally asked. Vance considered the question. "Partially to see how you're doing firsthand. Partially because today marks 6 months since we met, and that seems significant somehow." He paused. "And partially because I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Michael was genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me why I entered politics in the first place," Vance said simply. "It's easy to get caught up in the machinery of campaigns and policies and forget the human beings at the center of it all." Michael nodded, understanding. The machine versus the humanity. It's a struggle in any system, I suppose. Exactly. And our conversation that day, it wasn't about politics or policies or programs, not really. It was about dignity, about seeing people for who they are, not just the circumstances they're in. The waitress delivered their sandwiches, and both men began eating, comfortable enough with each other now to share a meal without forced conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said that day," Vance continued eventually, "about how the different services for homeless people are all separate pieces that don't connect properly, about how dignity gets lost first. And we've been working on a pilot program based partly on those insights, a more integrated approach that addresses housing, employment, healthcare, and social reconnection as interconnected needs, not isolated problems." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Like New Start?" "Similar, but broader in scope and with sustainable funding mechanisms," Vance explained. "New Start is effective, but limited in capacity. We're looking at ways to scale that model while preserving the personalized approach." "Sounds promising," Michael acknowledged, "though the real test is always in the implementation." Vance smiled slightly. "You've become quite the policy critic." "I've lived both sides now," Michael said with a shrug. "Gives you perspective." They continued their meal, the conversation shifting to Michael's work, his visits with Sarah and the boys, his plans for the future. There was an ease between them now, not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect born of shared experience. As they finished, Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Michael catch his breath, a dollar bill, crisp and new. "I've carried this with me for 6 months," Vance said, placing it on the table between them, "to remind me of our conversation, of what can happen when we truly see each other." Michael stared at the dollar, a perfect echo of the one Vance had given him that first day, the one Michael had carefully saved in a small frame on his bedside table. "6 months ago, you asked me for $1, Vance continued. "Today, I'd like to ask something of you." "What's that?" Michael asked cautiously. "That forum I mentioned, about homelessness solutions. It's been rescheduled for next month. Your perspective would be invaluable, not as a political symbol, but as someone with lived experience and thoughtful insights." Michael considered the request. 6 months ago, he would have seen this as exploitation, as being used for someone else's political narrative. Now, from a position of stability and strength, he saw it differently, as an opportunity to shape systems that might help others still trapped where he had been. I'll do it, he decided, not to tell my story as some kind of inspiration porn, but to point out where the systems fail and how they might work better. That's exactly what we need, Vance nodded. As they prepared to leave, Michael reached for the check, but Vance was quicker. Please, Vance said. Let me. Michael smiled slightly. Next time, I'll get it. Outside, they shook hands in the same spot where they had first met 6 months earlier. No cameras this time, no audience, no political theater. Just two men whose lives had intersected in a way neither could have predicted. Take care of yourself, Michael, Vance said, and stay in touch. You too, Michael replied, meaning it. As they parted ways, Michael glanced back at the spot where he had stood that day, cup extended, asking for $1. The man who had stood there, desperate, invisible, disconnected, seemed both intimately familiar and impossibly distant now. Michael Donovan had asked for $1 and received something far more valuable, a path back to himself. And in that journey from invisibility to recognition, from isolation to connection, he had discovered that the most powerful form of help was the kind that saw not just the outstretched hand, but the whole person behind it.